Brennan Manning, author and lecturer, says of faith, he says, the splendor of the human heart that believes God's word, that gives God more pleasure than the Westminster Cathedral, than Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, than Van Gogh's work of art, Sunflowers, than the sight of 10,000 butterflies in flight, than the scent of 1,000,000 orchids in bloom. Believing God is our gift back to God. And God finds it so enchanting that Jesus died for love of it. What is faith? Faith is believing God, believing what He says, believing it's true. The second aspect of biblical faith that God tells us about here in this passage is that faith is obeying God. Obeying is the word to write in your outline. Faith is obeying God. And I believe that this is a very, very important aspect of what it means to have faith in God. For God defines faith in this passage, and He does so by using example after example after example of people who had faith. Abraham, Noah, Abel, and all of these people are in the hall of faith because they obeyed God. They believed God, they believed Him, the first part of faith, and they obeyed God. Noah built the ark. Abel made the better offering for a sacrifice. Hebrews 11 says that Abraham obeyed God, and then it describes what he did. He moved from his father's land to a land he didn't know. He was willing to sacrifice his son. Abraham had faith in God. We know that because he obeyed God. There's nobody in this chapter 11 of Hebrews who said, I believe God, but then didn't obey. Every one of these Old Testament saints believed, and they showed their belief by obeying God. God made promises to Abraham, but those promises had one condition, and that was that Abraham had to obey. He had to leave his father's land. He had to go out and trust. If we say we have faith in God, but then we don't obey God, then we really don't have faith in God. If we say we have faith in God, yet our lives look in every way just like our unsaved neighbors and coworkers and fellow students, then we really don't have faith in God if we don't obey. As God defines faith in Hebrews chapter 11, He uses action words, words of obedience. When He's just talking about the saints, in Hebrews 11, He uses words like they conquered, they administered, they gained, they shut, they quenched, they escaped. If we have faith in God, then we will obey God. One recent study by Touchstone magazine said that U.S. citizens are quick to embrace faith, but only insofar as it's able to give them comfort and support for the choices, the moral choices that they make. He says, the article said that when faith fails to do this, people's commitment to God drop off sharply. As long as faith makes us feel good, then we're all for faith as a country. But when it challenges us, then we drop it. God makes it clear that faith is an action word, and that faith means obeying. And most of the time, that obedience is going to be difficult. Faith is not easy. Forgiving others is not easy. Serving others is not easy. Making sacrifices for the Lord is not easy. Faith is believing God, and faith is obeying God. A third aspect of faith that we find in Hebrews 11 is that faith is for ordinary Christians. Faith is for ordinary Christians. We call this passage the Hall of Faith, and we probably tend to think that the people listed here are especially heroic. And I know that I'm not heroic, and you probably don't think you're heroic either, so this faith stuff must be for super believers. Just for the people like Jim Elliot and Eric Little. But if we stop and we reflect on this list, if you look at the names that are listed in this Hall of Faith, we realize that there's much about the people that are listed here that are less than super. That's less than admirable. Noah, for example, got drunk and exposed himself. Abraham lied about Sarah. Isaac lied about Rebekah. Jacob was a deceiver. Moses committed murder. Gideon was a doubter. David was an adulterer and a murderer. And we don't have time to talk about Samson. These people were heroes not because they were different from you and me. They were heroes because they believed God and they obeyed Him just like you and I do. And they made mistakes and they failed just like you and I do. But they kept believing. And every day I see ordinary believers living out their faith in the way they spend their money and their time and their talents, in the way they face suffering and sickness and death. A third aspect of biblical faith is that faith is for ordinary Christians. It's for you and me. A fourth aspect of faith that God gives us here in Hebrews 11 is that faith is no guarantee of a problem-free life. Faith is no guarantee of a problem-free life. This is also a very important aspect of the faith that we must understand, or we're either going to become confused or very frustrated. If we think that faith means that God is going to take care of all of our problems, then we are going to live a frustrated life as believers. Being an ordinary Christian who has faith in God, who expresses faith in obedience, that doesn't mean that we're going to have a problem-free life. God does not guarantee an easy road for those who have faith in Him. Notice how God defines faith in this passage with all of these examples of how God sometimes provided immediate positive outcomes with some of these believers in Hebrews 11. But sometimes faith and obedience in God had a delayed positive outcome. The believer had to wait a long time for the answer that he or she was looking for. And sometimes, in some of these examples, the believer who was trusting God, was believing God, was obeying Him, they had a negative outcome. Those are all three scenarios for the people in Hebrews chapter 11. For example, the children of Israel, they passed through the Red Sea, they marched around the walls of Jericho, and the enemy's city's walls collapsed, and they took the city. That was an immediate positive outcome of their faith, of their trust in God and their obedience to Him. But then Sarah and Abraham, they had to wait a long time for their son to be born. And that was another positive outcome, but there was a long waiting period. A long, difficult waiting period. And then there were people like Abel, who exercised great faith, and he was still murdered.